So I'm a big advocate of people being a borderless investor, and of course Melbourne and Sydney have done really great over the last part of the cycle. But what if you actually don't live in Melbourne and you want to know some of the quirks about investing in Melbourne as to what you should be looking for? So I thought I'd give the top 5 considerations when investing in Melbourne. And my first one is really, it seems pretty obvious to me living in Melbourne, but for a lot of people it may not be. But the first one is auctions. Most investment grade properties typically go to auction. So if you're not comfortable with the auction process, you need to come up to speed very quickly. Because chances are, if you've found a property that you really like that's close to the CBD, the agent's going to want to take it to auction. And there is a real art and there's a real skill around buying properties at auction. And if you think about the fact that most people would rather be in the casket than deliver the eulogy through that fear of public speaking, the same thing applies when you're going to an auction. It's a public speaking environment. It's very intimidating and you can have ice running through your veins. But unfortunately, it's a high value transaction that you're entering into through that process. So for me, the number one consideration for anyone who doesn't live in Melbourne wanting to buy property as an investment in Melbourne is understand the auction process and be comfortable with it very quickly. The second thing for interstate people to consider is coffee. Melbourne people love coffee. But if you think about the fact that we've got 4 seasons in one day, it's not as if we're always flocking to the beach or flocking to our bikes. And the lifestyle component for us is learning to deal with the fact that the weather could be quite cold and miserable. So we're used to going to cafes, we're used to going to restaurants, we're used to socialising with people indoors, and invariably that comes around having a good cup of coffee. Now personally for me, I love the smell and hate the taste, but I am well and truly in the minority because lots of people will drive across town to their favourite cafe to get that wonderful cup of coffee that they're looking for. So when it comes to investing in property, if you can be near these villages, you can be near these lifestyle locations so that people can walk there on the weekend and go and get their favourite Eggs Benedict with that beautiful baristed cup of, freshly baristed cup of coffee, that will help you get an understanding of what drives the culture here in Melbourne. The third thing I'd say that's really important is it's a big city with lots and lots of people, and the population is set to double in the next 30 years. So that's lots of people moving around this city. So therefore you want to make sure that you're considering trains, because a lot of people don't want to drive you. It's not like you're in Adelaide, you get in the car, you go to the city, you can find a car park very quickly. In Melbourne you can't do that. So it's important that you take into account the train network and how far a property is away from the nearest train station. But a little footnote to that it's trains over trams. Because if you think about the postcard view of Melbourne, it's either the MCG, Flinders Street Station, or a picture of a tram. And it looks really great, the tourists love jumping on it. But for the locals, they prefer not to commute on a tram. They'd actually prefer to commute on a train because the tram's so stop-start, it's on the road, it's usually following other cars, there's pedestrians everywhere. It just doesn't feel as efficient getting into work when all I want to do is get from A to B as quickly as I can. So that's another quirk about investing in the Melbourne marketplace, is to take into account the trains and have trains over trams. Another consideration for interstate investors is you're going to probably spend a bit of money on due diligence without a guarantee of an outcome. So by that I mean, if I'm in Queensland, if I'm in Brisbane for example, it's quite common for me to put in an offer subject to finance, subject to building and pest. I get the offer accepted and then I can do my due diligence after the date, and if it gets satisfied I can then make the contract go unconditional. But if you think about in Melbourne, quite often you're buying at auction, under the hammer unconditional, so you have to get your building and pest done in advance. You have to get the solicitor to check the contract in advance. You may need to fly down and check out the properties, all those travel costs in advance without any guarantee of getting that property. And it's not uncommon for people to spend 2 and 3 and maybe even 4 sets of building and pest, solicitors' fees, and still miss out on properties, which really goes back to my first point of understanding the auction process and understanding how the price guides work in this city so that you don't get caught spending heaps of money on due diligence when you know that there's no guarantee of the outcome. And the fifth one for me, or the fifth point, is it's a very eclectic and diverse migrant mix in this country, a very high percentage of the population of Melbourne were born somewhere else. So there's all these areas within Melbourne. So if you think about the east, there's lots of Chinese. You think about the inner north, lots of Greeks and Italians. You think about over in the west, there's a culture of Indians. Down to the south, the Europeans, particularly the English, stay around the bayside and they go up in the hills. So you need to understand the mix and the cultures that exist in this city, but importantly, find the properties that actually cater to that cultural mix. You know, the Southeast Asian population are used to living in higher density, whereas if you think about people that come over from England, they're used to having a little bit more space. So it's important that you do not buy a property in a cultural mix that doesn't suit those people. So understanding that is really, really important. So I guess Melbourne is the most livable city in the world, 7 years running. I mean, it got 97.5 out of 100 in the most recent, survey with The Economist. So it's a very, very desirable city. But the important thing is don't impose your interstate paradigms when you're buying in Melbourne, because Queensland has that laid-back lifestyle, Sydney has that beach culture, but in Melbourne, it's very, very different to a lot of the other areas around Australia. So I guess it just highlights that Australia is not one big market, but it's made up of hundreds and hundreds of submarkets. And within Melbourne, you need to understand the quirks that exist before you buy in this city.